When we talk about the great achievements of antiquity, we often point to things like monumental architecture or maybe military conquest. Big, visible stuff.
Right, the Colosseum, the Parthenon, things you can see.
Exactly. But maybe the true foundation of civilization lies in something far less tangible, yet, well, ultimately more enduring.
It is.
The impulse to write laws down, to literally carve order into stone or text, creating a defined, accessible system of justice. We might think of these grand displays, but the real insights often come from decoding the specific language of the law itself.
But that's absolutely right. And today our mission is really to unpack an incredibly dense and, I think, fascinating stack of source material that spans the legal DNA of the classical Greek world and Republican Rome.
Okay.
We're synthesizing material that ranges from, the earliest codes intended to halt blood vengeance in Athens all the way to the rigid, highly formal definitions of contract and property that really fueled the Roman Empire.
So our goal here is to try and extract the core nuggets, right? To see how these two, frankly, radically different city-states attempted to manage social chaos, define status, and resolve disputes.
Yeah, we're focusing specifically on the contrast. You've got the highly agonistic, almost rhetorical justice of Athens on one hand.
And the formal, definitional, sort of hierarchical justice of Rome on the other.
Precisely. Okay, so let's unpack this journey into ancient justice. And I think we have to start with that moment. Athenian society began to pull itself out of these cycles of personal violence and establish some kind of public authority.
Which means we have to start with Draco.
Right. The creation of Draco's law on homicide, probably late 7th century BCE, represents maybe the most pivotal moment in early Greek legal history. It really was the moment the state definitively asserted its authority over something that had previously been, well, sacred.
Sacred how?
It was the inherited duty of the victim's family, the genos, to pursue vengeance. It wasn't just an option, it was an obligation.
Okay, so if we try and put ourselves in that pre-draconian world, if you killed someone, the entire extended family of the person who died was morally, socially obligated to pursue vengeance.
Not just against the killer, either.
Against the killer's entire family. Wow, that sounds like a recipe for perpetual conflict.
It was a cycle of blood that could, and did, rip the social fabric apart. That's the core danger Draco's law was designed to contain. It effectively outlawed retaliatory killing by bringing all homicides under the exclusive jurisdiction of public authority.
So the state takes over. How did that work?
Well, the cases were now managed by officials, specifically the kings, who likely presided over initial inquiries and then ultimately decided by a body of judges known as the Ephetae.
But it wasn't just about where the trial happened, was it? It seems like the really big shift was about who was held responsible. It fundamentally redefined liability.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the revolutionary aspect that often gets overlooked. Draco's legislation established a direct individual standard of liability.
Individual, not collective.
Exactly. This is a radical political statement at the time. It explicitly rejected the old, incredibly dangerous doctrine of vicarious liability, holding the whole family responsible.
Can you give us a concrete example of that older way, the vicarious liability?
Well, the sources repeatedly mention the famous case of the Alcmeonids. They were a very powerful Athenian family, Aeginos.
Right.
When a guy named Cylon attempted a coup, his followers ended up taking sanctuary at an altar. Members of the Alcmeonid family were involved in killing them, even though they had sanctuary status, which was a huge religious violation.
A sacrilege?
Precisely. And for that crime, the entire Alcmeonid genus, the whole extended clan, was condemned and exiled, not just the individuals involved. Draco's law, specifically for homicide, effectively said that kind of collective guilt, collective punishment for the genus, it ends here.
So if the law was trying to stop the feud by focusing on the individual, how did they define the killer? Was it just the person who, actually wielded the weapon?
The source material is actually very specific on this. It defines two legal equivalents of homicide and, crucially, limits responsibility just to those two categories.
Okay, what are they?
First, the person who killed with one's own hand, the direct actor. Pretty straightforward.
And the second?
The one who conspired to kill. The sources use the term ho boulousa, literally, the man who planned or instigated the murder.
Okay, so the actor and the planner. By limiting the legal definition just to those two?
They legally immunized everyone else. The killer's kin, their family, were legally safe from further retribution, provided they didn't actively aid or abet the crime themselves.
That must have been critical for political stability.
Absolutely critical. It allowed the community to hold the individual accountable while preventing that automatic escalation of violence that could just ensnare entire factions in a widening feud. This move really transformed vengeance from a private family right, even a duty, into a state obligation. Hashtag 1.2 law and the agonistic ethos.
Yeah.
But, even with Draco's code in place, the Athenian legal system never really became purely neutral or abstract in the way we might imagine modern justice. Not at all.
How so?
It remained deeply embedded in the competitive, sometimes quite aggressive nature of Athenian public life, what scholars call the agonistic ethos, the spirit of competition, of contest.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. It feels like the blood feud didn't entirely disappear. Maybe it just relocated
Yeah,
to the courtroom floor.
that's a great way to put it.
Litigation wasn't just about resolving a dispute. It was often weaponized.
That's the key insight, really. For an Athenian citizen, the courts became the primary arena for pursuing and extending ongoing personal and political conflicts. The law provided the formal language, the structure.
But the underlying motivation was often just pure competition, harassment, intimidation.
Often, yes. If you read the surviving speeches from Athenian courts, people like Demosthenes, Lysias, they detail these incredibly long, drawn-out feuding relationships where the court system is just used repeatedly as a tool for social combat. Making accusations became a political tactic.
Wow. That sounds incredibly volatile. I mean, if the whole system is built on antagonism, how did the law manage to keep social order from just collapsing into continuous infighting or even, civil war?
Well, the law had to actively regulate actions that were seen as direct threats to the stability of the polis itself. The specific target was something they called stasis-producing hubris.
Stasis-producing hubris. That's a powerful term. What does it mean exactly? How did an offense against one person become a threat that could produce stasis civil strife?
Okay, so hubris wasn't just simple arrogance or pride. It was understood as an extreme, public, and really arrogant violation of established social norms. It was about dishonoring the victim in a way that publicly insulted their standing, their time in the community.
And certain kinds were seen as particularly dangerous.
Yes. The sources really emphasize that specific forms of hubris, particularly sexual aggression or transgression against women and freeborn children, were viewed almost as existential threats.
Why specifically those?
Because when a citizen's wife or daughter was violated, the dishonor was seen as intolerable. If the law didn't provide a recognized formal path for redress, the victim's genos, their family, would feel compelled to respond with immediate, probably violent vengeance to restore their honor.
And that private response could spiral.
Exactly. That private feud would inevitably pull political factions into the conflict, potentially escalating into the kind of full-scale civil disturbance stasis that thinkers like Isocrates explicitly warned against. So the law had to step in to contain that potential escalation.
So the law functions almost like a pressure release valve. It institutionalizes the fight, maybe. It changes the currency of conflict from blood to speeches.
That's a brilliant connection. And it's something the Athenians themselves clearly understood, even on an intellectual level. We can connect this legal shift directly to the intellectual and theatrical life of the city.
You're thinking of tragedy.
Absolutely. Aeschylus's dramatic trilogy, the Oresteia, provides a perfect parallel framework for this very legal transition.
Because it dramatizes the end of the blood curse, right? The whole cycle of revenge in the house of Atreus.
Precisely. The whole trilogy is dominated by that violent narrative pattern of the ancient curse.
Yeah.
The doer suffers, the payment for a bloody blow must be a bloody blow. Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, Orestes, it just goes on.
Until the end.
Right. The tragedy resolves not in more violence, not even in a direct divine decree, but in the establishment of a human institution. The court of the Eumenides, the Areopagus court in Athens, presided over by the goddess Athena herself.
So it signifies the institutionalization of justice within the polis.
Exactly. The violence of revenge is literally transformed into the conflict of speeches, the formalized, persuasive argument of the courtroom. The Furies become the Eumenides, the kindly ones. The message seems pretty clear. Persuasion, Pitho, has to triumph over the thunderbolt of arbitrary violence or endless blood feud. Hashtag 1.3, the burden of citizenship in Athens.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal framework for dealing with violence and conflict, but what about the everyday demands of just being a citizen in Athens? It seems like it wasn't just about rights and voting.
Not at all. To be a privileged citizen in democratic Athens came with a massive cost. It was fundamentally about compulsory service. And for the wealthy citizens, this service was extremely onerous.
You mean the financial duties, the liturgies?
Yes, exactly. The liturgies were compulsory public services that the wealthiest citizens were required to perform and fund out of their own private fortunes.
Like what kind of things?
Well, the most famous is probably the triarchy fitting out and maintaining a warship for the Navy for a year. Hugely expensive. Or financing the dramatic chorus for one of the big religious festivals. These weren't small contributions. They could be ruinous.
And this was on top of other financial demands.
Oh, yes. This was layered on top of other compulsory financial contributions, notably the aisphora. That was an extraordinary property tax, often quite unpopular, levied specifically to finance wars.
So the wealthy citizen wasn't just expected to support the city financially in peacetime, they were absolutely required to fund it in wartime.
Correct. And crucially, they were also expected to fight in that war.
Right. So the financial burden was layered directly onto military obligations, primarily serving as hoplites, the heavy infantry.
Absolutely. And what the sources really hit home is that the wealthy felt these duties very keenly because they were an additional imposition. A man performing a massive, costly financial liturgy could simultaneously be conscripted for hoplite service abroad. There was really no escaping public duty if you had wealth.
But then, when it came to military performance itself, say actually enforcing bravery or prosecuting cowardice after a big defeat, the city's will seems to have faltered legally sometimes. Why were they reluctant to use the full weight of the law there?
That's a really fascinating tension in the system. The city was, it seems, remarkably reluctant to exercise legal compulsion regarding military failures, especially when it involved a general rout or a collective failure on the battlefield.
Why? Too many people involved.
The sources suggest that prosecuting an entire group of citizens, maybe hundreds or thousands, for cowardice was just seen as too socially destabilizing, too divisive. So the city relied more on public discourse, shame, rhetoric, trying to exhort courage before battle, rather than relying on harsh legal punishment after a defeat.
So instead of prosecuting the whole group for a collective defeat, like a rout, maybe they'd single out a prominent political figure, use them as a target.
That's exactly how the system often functioned in practice. Prominent public figures were incredibly vulnerable to accusations of cowardice, even if the actual factual grounds for a formal conviction were pretty tenuous.
Can you give an example?
Well, think about Demosthenes. After the devastating defeat at the Battle of Chaeronea against Philip of Macedon, it was a disaster for Athens.
Right.
Afterwards, no rival actually seems to have sought to formally prosecute him under the specific legal charge of cowardice. Deal, yeah.
But the accusation itself hung in the air, became a political weapon.
Absolutely it did. His political enemies, like Aeschines, constantly used the rhetoric of cowardice to damage his reputation in public speeches and debates. They effectively achieved a political penalty, tarnishing his image without ever risking a formal legal trial, which they might have lost.
So the city kind of willed the ignominy of the collective rout into oblivion.
But the individual shame, weaponized through rhetoric, stuck to those figures who were politically exposed. That reliance on public accusation and shame, rather than strict legal process for something like military failure, perfectly encapsulates that agonistic, rhetorical nature of Athenian public life and justice.
Yeah, that emphasis on public spectacle, personal shame, rhetoric. It feels like a world away from the kind of system Rome built.
It really is.
Let's talk about that Roman system then. How Roman justice seemed to value definition, formalism, hierarchy much more than public spectacle.
Yeah, when we cross over to Rome, we encounter a legal culture that seems almost obsessed with clarity, definition, and formal rigor. This starts very early on with their first major codification, the 12 Tables, around 450 BCE.
Which was itself a result of social conflict, right, between patricians and plebeians.
Exactly. It was intended, at least in theory, to reduce aristocratic arbitrariness by writing the laws down for everyone to see.
And what's fascinating is how selective those early Roman penalties were, especially the capital ones.
Indeed. The 12 Tables are often quoted by later Roman writers as sanctioning per pacus res capite. Very few things were punishable by death. But the few they did include give us a really strong sense of early Roman priorities. They were deeply concerned about social order and public reputation.
And one of those capital crimes, surprisingly perhaps, dealt with public defamation or insult, making up nasty songs about people.
Yes, it's quite startling. The sources note the extreme penalty death for anyone who defamed another by singing or composing a carmen, which could be a song, a verse, even a magic chant, which caused infamy or disgrace, infamiam carceret flagitum ve alteri.
Wow. So Rome put public verbal defamation essentially on par with treason or maybe major property crimes.
It seems so, yes. It tells us how profoundly important public image, fama, and defined social standing were to the stability of the early republic. Any attack that seriously damaged a man's public reputation was seen as tearing at the very fabric of the community.
Okay, now let's shift to how they managed agreements. The Athenian system, as we saw, relied a lot on reputation, social pressure, maybe oaths. Rome, conversely, created this thing called the stipulatio, a highly rigid verbal contract. Why did they need such a constrained, formal process?
The stipulatio, which was essentially a formal question and answer process, was, I think, a genuine stroke of legal ingenuity. It was especially useful in a time when written evidence was often unreliable, difficult to verify, maybe easy to forge or simply lose. The rigidity was actually its strength.
How did it work in practice? Can you walk us through it?
Sure, the promisee, the person who was owed something, the creditor, had to state the exact terms of the agreement in the form of a question. For example, do you promise, spondesni, to pay me 100 sesterces on the calends of March at the Forum Boarium? Very specific.
Okay. And the other person?
The promiser, the debtor, had to reply immediately using the exact corresponding verb, I do promise, spondeo.
Yeah.
It had to match precisely. Any deviation might invalidate the contract.
Huh. So by forcing that verbal inversion, the promisee, articulating the terms as a question, it kind of forces the promiser's attention, right? Prevents them from just nodding along or, as you say, gliding over a dangerous pledge.
Exactly. It mandates conscious, public, rigorous consent to the exact terms laid out. It creates certainty.
And predictability.
Absolutely. The formality ensured that both parties were fully aware of the extent and the precise parameters of the binding agreement they were entering into. And because that specific verbal form defined the contract, the subsequent legal action, the actio based on the stipulatio, was perfectly structured to enforce those exact terms and nothing else. This certainty was paramount for commerce, for defining obligations clearly, and ultimately for building the kind of stable foundation an empire needs.
Now, as the Roman legal system developed this incredibly rigorous, practical body of law, their jurists also started grappling with deeper philosophical questions, didn't they, about universal justice? We see this tension emerge between intinius gentium and intinius naturale.
Yes, this is where Roman legal thinking gets truly fascinating, and frankly, quite sophisticated. Intinius gentium was understood as the law of nations, basically, the body of rules and practices observed as common among all peoples they encountered. It was essentially the practical law governing interactions across the expanding empire.
Okay, law common to everyone. And ius naturale.
Ius naturale was natural law, the theoretical, perfect, universal law derived from reason or nature itself.
It seems intuitive, maybe, to think the two should align, doesn't it? That the law common to all people should be the law of nature.
That's what you might think. But the more philosophically inclined Roman lawyers strongly resisted that easy equation. And this marks a really profound intellectual moment. They looked closely at the actual content of the Ius Gentium, the law of nations, in practice. And they realized it could not possibly represent some perfect lost code of nature. Why? Because the Ius Gentium was the very body of law that justified things like war, the taking of captives, and the institution of slavery.
Things that natural reason might condemn.
Exactly. They understood that the practical functional law of nations, the law that made the empire work in many ways, contained profound injustices that a pure natural law would surely reject. This forced them to make a crucial and perhaps uncomfortable distinction. What is useful and necessary for the administration of a vast empire is not always the same as what is universally just or morally right, according to nature.
Okay, let's talk about persons then. If we look at Roman law concerning people, the division seems incredibly stark, doesn't it? The fundamental legal division was between free men, laber, and slaves, servi.
Absolutely fundamental. That was the primary legal axis around which status revolved. But, and this is typically Roman, even within that apparently stark division, their jurists created incredible degrees of complexity and nuance.
Why complicate it?
Well, that complexity allowed the system to remain flexible and functional, especially for managing a massive slave-owning economy. A great example of this is the mechanism for conditional release of slaves' manumission, but with strings attached. It is a complex compromise that actually benefited both the master and the slave in different ways.
How is this conditional release structured? You said the master still retained rights.
He absolutely did. Often the master retained a powerful lien, a legal claim, on the slave's future services or earnings, opere. Sometimes this involved years of continued service. sometimes a partial payment of the slave's market value over time.
So the master gets continued benefit.
Yes, it allowed the master to capitalize on the slave's accrued value, their skills, their experience, without the immediate cost and hassle of finding and training a replacement. But for the slave, conditional release offered something very valuable too: substantial, immediate security.
Security against what, exactly, if they're still partly obligated?
Security against the sheer volatility and risk of sudden, complete independence in a very harsh world. By remaining connected to the ex-owner, often as a clients to their patron, patronus, they secured their existing socioeconomic role. They avoided the often brutal risks of having to find a totally new niche, a new means of survival in a competitive, unforgiving society. They essentially paid only a fraction of their market value for this quasi-freedom, this managed risk approach to independence.
That focus on the master's control, even after a kind of freedom, leads us right to the heart of Roman family law, the concept of potestas, the absolute power of the master, or the father, paterfamilias, over his household. How did that power impact legal liability within the home?
The potestas was absolutely defining for legal action, or very often the lack thereof. The core principle was that a master or father, dominus or paterfamilias, could not bring a formal legal action, like an action for theft, actio fruti, against a slave or a son who was still under his potestas.
Wait, even if the son or slave clearly stole something from him?
Even then, no formal lawsuit was possible.
That sounds like a fundamental denial of legal rights or process within the family unit itself.
It is, from our perspective.
Yeah.
But the reason given by the Roman jurists is brutally efficient and tells us everything about Roman household authority. They said the master can deal with a thief in his household just as he pleases. He doesn't need the state's court system to address internal crimes because his domestic authority, his potestas, is legally supreme within the household. He is, in effect, the judge and jury within the walls of his own home. He could punish them directly, sell the slave, etc.
Okay, but this raises a really important and tricky question, surely, for the jurists. What if that slave or son is later sold, or the slave is manumitted? Does the crime they committed while they were under potestas suddenly become actionable? Can the new owner, or maybe the state, prosecute that old theft years later?
This was definitely debated among the jurists, but the prevailing ruling was remarkably consistent. The actionlessness persisted. Once impossible, always impossible.
Really?
The jurists generally concluded that since no formal legal action could have been raised at the outset against a person under potestas for an internal crime like theft from the master, then no such action could magically arise later, even after they left that state of potestas. The legal possibility of the action was extinguished at the source.
So the focus was on maintaining the absolute sanctity and complete authority of that paternal household at the time the act was committed.
Exactly. Even if it meant that, from the state's perspective, the crime effectively went unpunished by the formal legal system after manumission or emancipation. This again really prioritizes the defined hierarchy and internal authority of the Roman household over, say, an abstract principle of delayed prosecution by the state. Hashtag tag 2.3 family property and the dowry, the woman's stake. Now, while the paterfamilias held enormous sway, Roman women were not entirely without economic leverage or legal standing, especially when it came to the dowry, the dowas.
Right, the property a woman brought into a marriage. The dowry recovery mechanism seems like an obvious economic safeguard for the woman if the marriage dissolved through divorce or death. But the sources suggest its importance was seen as far greater than just protecting her personal property.
Oh, absolutely. The Roman jurists elevated the principle of dowry recovery into a matter of high public policy. They explicitly argued that it was in the public interest for women to keep their dowries.
Why? What was the public interest argument?
The specific rationale given in the sources is quite direct, so that they can produce offspring and replenish the state with their children. The dowry was viewed as an essential economic component for the continuation and stability of the Roman state itself. It ensured that women, upon divorce or widowhood, had the means to remarry or at least support themselves and raise future Roman citizens.
Wow, that's a really powerful social sanction for what is essentially a property mechanism. It raises the status of the dowry from just a family asset to something vital for the state.
It really does. And what's perhaps surprising is that the dowry wasn't necessarily locked away entirely, untouchable for the whole duration of the marriage. Roman law actually allowed for specific circumstances under which a portion of the dowry could be returned to the wife, even while the marriage was still active and ongoing.
When would that happen? That seems counterintuitive if the husband is generally supposed to manage the marital property during the marriage.
The law allowed for this return, erogatio dotis, in cases of genuine specific necessity, carefully defined. This included situations where the wife needed funds to support herself or her children adequately, maybe if the husband wasn't providing, or to buy a necessary estate for her own livelihood, or even to sustain a needy member of her immediate birthkin, which could be a parent, a sibling, or, interestingly, even the husband himself, if he had fallen into proven need.
So it shows a kind of pragmatic flexibility in property law. The dowry could function almost as a crucial form of social insurance, extending its benefit even beyond the immediate marital unit, back to her birth family, or even to prop up the husband.
Exactly. It reveals a practical approach embedded within the formalism.
Okay, finally, just as with property and status, Roman law was intensely focused on defining and protecting degrees of kinship, wasn't it? Viewing certain marriages as potentially threatening to social order.
Yes, definitely. The prohibitions against marriage between closely related kin, like uncle and niece, or aunt and nephew, were generally strong and considered quite important, touching on both religious and social sensitivities.
And the controversial nature of this principle is really highlighted by that exceptional allowance made specifically for one emperor, right? Claudius?
Yes, Emperor Claudius. He wanted to marry his own niece, Agrippina the Younger, who was his brother Germanicus's daughter. This clearly violated the established norm against uncle-niece marriage.
So what happened? Did he just ignore the law?
No, he couldn't just ignore it. The sources confirmed that a specific and apparently highly controversial senatorial decree, Senatus Consultum, was passed to create an exception, allowing this specific marriage to proceed legally.
The fact that the emperor, the most powerful man in the world, had to secure this special, exceptional allowance. What does that tell us?
It underscores just how politically and socially sensitive these kinship rules were in Rome. It shows that even the emperor felt compelled to seek formal legal cover to override what was clearly a deeply entrenched social and legal principle. It indicates that these rules about kinship and marriage were viewed as fundamental to the state's moral and social fabric, not just arbitrary regulations.
Okay, we've gone pretty deep into the foundations of state justice in Athens and the Roman focus on private property, status, and contract. Now we need to look outward. How did this complex Roman machine actually govern the massive territory it acquired?
Right. When the Roman Republic first started expanding significantly, its initial approach to governing the internal provinces, the ones closer to home, was really rooted in the aristocratic ideal. Governing wasn't seen as a professional career path.
It was more like an honor, a temporary public duty.
Exactly. Governance was handled by these amateur avocational notables, basically, members of the Senate appointed by the Senate itself, often by lot or rotation.
And they didn't stay long.
No, they were given very short tenures of office, usually just a year, maybe two at most. And crucially, they were deliberately excluded from the actual work of tax collecting. That was often privatized, contracted out to companies of public handing.
Why structure it that way? Short terms, no tax power.
The entire structure seems designed to limit individual aristocratic power and prevent any single governor or proconsul from establishing a permanent personalized base of power out in the provinces. It was about maintaining the collective, oligarchic control of the Senate back in Rome.
But surely, once the empire solidified under the emperors, that kind of temporary amateur system just couldn't handle the sheer complexity, the scale, the need for long-term expertise required to manage the revenues and infrastructure of the entire Mediterranean world.
It absolutely couldn't. That inherent limitation, that failure, necessitated the dramatic rise of the imperial bureaucracy under the Principate, starting with Augustus. But this bureaucracy did not start as a professional civil service run by senators or even knights.
Where did it start then?
It began, quite remarkably, as essentially an extension of the emperor's private household administration, what historians often call a patrimonial bureaucracy. It grew out of the emperor's own staff managing his vast personal estates and finances.
And who was actually staffing these critical positions in the early imperial administration? Running the finances, handling correspondence?
Initially, they were staffed largely by the emperor's own slaves, and the highest positions within this household-based administration, heads of departments like finance, arationibus, or correspondence, epistolis, were often headed by his most trusted ex-slaves, his freedmen.
Freedmen running the empire. Why them?
The reason seems entirely practical. They offered the long-term expertise, the continuity, the absolute personal loyalty to the emperor, and perhaps a degree of institutional submissiveness that was often lacking among the high-status aristocrats, who still tended to view public service as a temporary honor rather than a lifelong career serving one man. These freedmen served the emperor directly, not the abstract state.
That must have been deeply irritating to the traditional Roman Senate, watching former slaves wielding enormous administrative power.
Oh, it was a constant source of friction and complaint in the sources written by senators. However, as the sheer scale of delegated power wielded by the emperor grew, the prestige attached to these crucial administrative roles, managing imperial finances, official correspondence, handling petitions, a libellus, inevitably increased.
So the status of the job rose.
Exactly. And the social status of the administrators gradually began to shift upwards. By the end of the 1st century AD, maybe early 2nd century, these top bureaucratic positions began to be increasingly filled and headed by members of the Second Estate, the knights or equestrians. This signals the gradual professionalization and formalization of the imperial service, moving beyond its origins in the emperor's household. Hashtag 3.2 relations with conquered peoples. Now, the relationship between Rome and its conquered subjects presents what some of the sources themselves call a singular spectacle. It's quite unique.
How so?
Well, Rome obviously retained its own institutions and its complex body of civil law, which was primarily intended for Roman citizens. But when Rome conquered a territory, the existing laws of the conquered subjects often just vanished, or they became functionally obsolete, particularly in public matters or interactions with Roman authority.
So the provincials were left in a kind of legal limbo. They weren't fully under Roman civil law, but they also lacked the protection or definition of their own native legal systems, especially regarding something as fundamental as property ownership.
That's the exact dilemma they faced. And Rome, being Rome, invented brilliant linguistic and legal artifices to manage this reality without either fully extending Roman law or fully recognizing native law.
What kind of artifices?
Well, provincials were generally allowed to retain practical possession and use of their land and property. They could farm it, sell it amongst themselves, pass it down. But legally, they were often denied full dominium, true, absolute Roman ownership under scleval law.
How did the jurists phrase this distinction, then? If they didn't own it, but they sort of did.
They used these clever legal fictions. For instance, they might say the land or property was as good as his, prosuo, implying effective ownership without the legal title, or that it was considered to be among his goods, in bonus, protected by the praetor's edict, even if not by the strict civil law.
So these fictions allowed provincial society and the economy to actually function. People could feel secure enough in their possessions.
Exactly. They provided enough stability and predictability for commerce, agriculture, and wealth accumulation to continue relatively smoothly, while simultaneously maintaining the ultimate legal and theoretical supremacy of Rome and Roman ownership over all imperial territory. It was a very sophisticated legal gymnastics act, really.
And this complexity applied equally to the concept of citizenship itself, didn't it? What was the actual value or status of Roman citizenship for a conquered subject? Particularly early on, it wasn't uniform.
Not at all. The status and rights attached to citizenship were highly variable, especially in the Republic and early Empire. We see concepts like the civitas sans suffragio, citizenship without the right to vote in Roman assemblies.
Where did that come from?
It was originally conceived, it seems, as a status used to incorporate certain conquered Italian communities into the Roman sphere. It granted private rights under Roman law, but withheld public political rights. Later Roman writers sometimes viewed this status either as a kind of punishment or, perhaps more positively, as merely a stepping stone towards eventual full citizenship rights.
And what about Rome's official allies? The socii. They weren't technically conquered subjects, were they? They were supposedly independent nations allied to Rome.
That was the formal position, yes. Rome always asserted the formal independence of its subjects, often describing them using terms like allies, socia, or even allies and friends, socia et amici. However, simultaneously, Rome subjected these allies to varying and often profound degrees of actual control, obligation, and intervention.
So the independence was a bit of a fiction.
Often, yes. And one source suggests this careful artifice of drawing a clear legal line between Rome, the citizens, and its supposedly independent allies was partly a clever device. It helped to ensure the Roman government against defects or failures in its own administrative machinery.
What do you mean by that? How did it ensure them?
Well, if a problem arose in allied territory, say, internal disorder or maladministration, Rome could, if convenient, disclaim direct responsibility for the day-to-day internal governance. They could maintain the fiction of the Allies' sovereignty while still asserting overall dominance, demanding military contributions, and intervening whenever Roman interests were deemed to be at stake. It allowed Rome to manage the immense risk and cost of having to directly administer every single detail of its vast and growing sphere of influence. Hashtag 3.3, contrasting Greek colonialism. It's maybe useful, just briefly, to look back at the Greek world that Rome eventually absorbed, because we see there a much more diverse set of economic and, consequently, legal foundations for political power compared to Rome's increasingly centralized and legally unified system.
Right. The sources you were looking at highlight significant distinctions even among the early Greek colonies themselves, say in Italy and Sicily.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you consider, for example, the Achaean colonies founded in Magna Graecia, southern Italy, places like Metapontion, or the famously luxurious Sybaris, their great wealth, and therefore much of their political power, seems to have depended almost entirely on the incredibly rich agricultural soil inland and extensive land ownership. Their elite were primarily defined by their agricultural holdings.
But other Greek cities, founded by different mother cities like Corinth or Chalcis, had a different basis for their power.
Entirely different, often. Cities like Syracuse, founded by Corinth, or Cumae, founded by Chalcis, their wealth and influence were inextricably tied to the sea, to maritime traffic, trade networks, control of ports.
So this contrast shows that early Greek political and economic models were actually highly decentralized and diverse. Power wasn't just based on one thing, like naval strength or a single legal code.
Precisely. Power was often predicated on these specialized economic models, some driven by exceptionally fertile land, others by strategic location for trade and maritime activity. This underlying economic diversity helps us understand, perhaps, the inherently fragmented nature of Greek law and politics compared to the much more unified, hierarchical, legal, and administrative structure that Rome eventually imposed on the Mediterranean world.
Okay, so we've traced these two paths, Athens and Rome. What does it all mean when we put the Athenian world of rhetorical, shame-based, agonistic justice next to the Roman world of rigid, formalized, hierarchical law? What's the big picture takeaway? Tag outro.
Well, I think this deep dive has shown us two vastly different foundational impulses when it comes to law and society. The Athenian system, born out of intense political competition and that agonistic societal conflict we talked about, found ways to channel that competitive energy. It channeled it into formalized but still intensely competitive litigation in the courts.
A system that weaponized public discourse and shame almost as much as it did formal legal penalties, always trying to control that threat of stasis, of civil strife.
Exactly. Whereas the Roman system, really driven by the practical needs of administering an immense and rigidly structured society, focused relentlessly on definitional clarity and procedural certainty.
Creating things like universal, structured, contracts the stipulatio, meticulously defining status boundaries, free versus slave, citizen versus non-citizen, and employing those pragmatic legal fictions like pro suo to govern its vast territorial holdings without having to rewrite the entire civil law.
Right. Rome seemed to value definitional clarity and the continuation of the state, its structures, above almost all else, even if that meant institutionalizing certain compromises, as we saw with things like conditional release for slaves or those dowry provisions designed to ensure future citizens.
So we've examined all these laws, from Draco trying to limit the blood feud to Roman dowry rules aimed at replenishing the state. They were clearly intended to create stability, to bring order. These texts reveal societies actively striving for order.
They do. But I think the sources also continually remind us that law almost always serves a dual function, doesn't it? It attempts to regulate behavior, yes, but it simultaneously reflects and sometimes even exacerbates the fundamental social divides that already exist within that society.
Divides like free versus slave, citizen versus ally, or provincial, rich versus poor. The law doesn't erase those lines. Sometimes it reinforces them.
Precisely. So the deepest dive ultimately isn't just into the written text of the law itself, but maybe into the messy, complex social realities that the law was trying and often perhaps failing to fully contain or resolve.
Looking at these ancient systems, we see law acting as this incredibly complex mechanism, often for managing ongoing conflict rather than definitively resolving it.
Yeah. And maybe if we apply that lens to our own time, we might ask ourselves a provocative question. What existing social conflict today is our own legal system primarily managing and institutionalizing, perhaps containing its worst effects, rather than truly moving towards a fundamental resolution?